Welcome to Impossible VHS here on the archive. Don't worry too much how you stumbled on this episode.
So what are you hiding in this archive? I'm a GlobeStar tenured employee. I deserve to know. It is way more than a curiosity at this point.
Sorry about that. That was Kevin. You will meet him in this episode, and yes, he is right to be curious. But curiosity in the wrong place somehow kills the cat, or however that saying goes. I'll just put Kevin back behind the counter. Nothing to see here, folks. We'll stick around for this episode. There is that. This is tape 004. This story rewards those who listen.
Oh, Hatman, you are back.
Like every time, I am not the Hatman. How do you even know the Milner? Enjoy, folks. Oh yeah, the word shit is used 8 to 11 times at the second half. If that offends you, just remember, Glenn is from another world and does not know our ways. Impossible VHS. Book 1, Warehouse Blue. Season 0, Side A. Chapter 3, GLEN. The thing about the GlobeStar overnight was that it had a rhythm, and Glenn had learned the rhythm the way you learn anything you do long enough, not by understanding it, but by becoming part of it, until the difference stopped mattering. 3:47 a.m. was the coffee rush. Not a rush in the sense of volume. A rush in the sense that between 3:45 and 4:15, a specific set of people came in for coffee with the reliability of a system that had been running long enough to smooth out its own edges. Darnell, who drove trucks and always paid exact change and never made eye contact, but always said much obliged when he left. The woman Glenn privately thought of as the banana lady, who bought one lottery ticket and one banana, and whose name he had never learned in 11 months because she had never offered it, and he had decided not to ask. A rotating cast of people who smelled like the end of a long shift and moved through the store with the specific economy of motion that comes from needing something and not having energy for anything else. Glenn made sure the coffee was fresh at 3:40. This was the job. He understood the job. What he was less clear on was the rest of it. He had been a contractor for 6 years before Earth. Not this kind of contractor. Not the kind who stood behind a register in a vest, making sure the coffee was fresh at 3:40 a.m. The kind who moved between systems doing intake work. Processing paperwork for new participants entering the distributed gig economy that most of the inhabited universe ran on without thinking about. The same way most of the inhabited universe didn't think about atmospheric processors or gravitational maintenance. Someone had to do the intake. Glenn had done it across 11 systems. It was not glamorous work, but it was consistent, and the per diem was reasonable, and he had been good at it in the specific way you become good at things you do long enough. Not through passion, but through accumulated competence. Earth had been his 12th system. The posting was routine. Non-interference planet, gig economy, integration phase, standard 6-month placement to process onboarding documentation for new contractors entering the distributed network. Glenn had done this 11 times. He had expected to do it an 11th time, file his departure paperwork, and move on to the 13th system. The pickup that was supposed to take him off planet after the placement had been rescheduled, then rescheduled again. then entered into a dispute resolution process that was, as far as GLEN could tell, specifically designed to generate additional dispute resolution processes. He had filed 4 complaints. Each complaint had been acknowledged with a form letter explaining that his complaint was important and would be reviewed within 30 to 45 business days, after which he had received another form letter explaining that his complaint had been reviewed and a follow-up complaint could be filed if he felt the resolution was unsatisfactory. He had stopped filing complaints after the 6th one. He had been on Earth for 11 months. The first 3 had been the actual placement, routine intake work, processing onboarding documentation for new contractors, doing the job correctly. He had lived in the ship. He had worked from the ship. He had filed his reports and maintained his certification and waited for the pickup that was going to take him to the 13th system. The pickup had not come. The remaining 8 months had been the other thing. The thing that happened after a contractor stopped being on a posting and started just being somewhere with no official status and a vehicle he wasn't supposed to leave unattended and a certification that stayed current if he kept doing the work and a per diem that had stopped arriving because the dispute resolution process had frozen the relevant account pending review. He had needed a job. GlobeStar was where that happened. GlobeStar was, technically, his other employer. Not in a way GLEN had fully worked out the implications of. The contractor network that had posted him to Earth, the distributed gig economy infrastructure, the intake processing system, the whole chain that ran from somewhere out there, down through the layers of acquisition and franchise to a gas station on Route 66 in Carthage, Missouri. That chain included GlobeStar, had always included GlobeStar. GlobeStar was the Earth-facing interface of the same network GLEN contracted through. He had understood this intellectually when he walked in looking for work. What he had not worked out was whether this made him an employee of his own contractor system, which was either a bureaucratic impossibility or completely standard, depending on which section of the contractor agreement you read and how you interpreted the definitions. He had filed this under too complicated, review later, possibly never. The manager had hired him in approximately 4 minutes. The interview had consisted of the manager asking if GLEN had ever operated a cash register, GLEN saying yes, and the manager saying good enough and handing him a vest. The manager had also asked where GLEN was from. Singapore. The manager had nodded with the specific nod of someone who has received information that explains something they weren't sure needed explaining. The GlobeStar corporate connection, the slightly formal precision, the thoroughness, the fact that GLEN did not appear to need sleep in quite the standard configuration, which on the overnight shift was a feature rather than a complication. Singapore covered all of it without requiring further discussion. GLEN wore the vest and operated the cash register. He held both jobs simultaneously. Contractor, technically still on posting, certification current, reports filed, dispute resolution ongoing. An overnight employee of a GlobeStar on Route 66 in Carthage, which paid cash and asked no questions, and was, he had come to understand, exactly the kind of place that was designed to accommodate people whose situations didn't map cleanly onto standard employment categories. He had thought about this sometimes during the overnight hours. Ping thought was a good company, GlobeStar was a good company. He wondered occasionally, in the specific idle way you wonder things at 3 a.m., when the store was quiet and the fluorescent light above Register 2 was doing its thing. Whether they had ever merged. What that would mean for his employment status. Whether he was currently working 2 jobs or 1 job that had folded back on itself somewhere in the corporate structure. He filed this under interesting. Do not examine directly. Make sure the coffee is fresh. He went home after his shifts to the apartment that had been Mike's and was now mostly Glen's, though he had left Mike's things where they were. The drawer full of unsorted things that Glen had organized once and then put back the way it was because it was Mike's drawer. And the way it was Mike's business. The plant did not improve. Glen watered it anyway. The clock ran 11 seconds fast. Glen timed it every morning. Noted the variance. Did not fix it. That was Mike's clock. He had given up the vehicle 3 months ago. Not because he had to, because he could. The ship was contractor registered. Technically the network's asset. Technically his responsibility while on posting. Technically not something he was supposed to reassign without authorization. But there was a provision in the contractor agreement, buried in a subsection of a subsection, that allowed a contractor, on extended pending status, to release a vehicle back to the available pool if the contractor had an alternative means of maintaining their posting location. He had the apartment. He had the GlobeStar job. He had an address. He had filed the vehicle release paperwork on a Tuesday at 11:23 p.m. The system had processed it the way it processed everything, eventually, on its own timeline, without acknowledgement. The ship had moved from his registration to the available pool. He had watched it go on his contractor device with the specific feeling of someone who has let go of something and is not certain whether they did the right thing and has decided the uncertainty is preferable to keeping hold of it. He had not told Mike. He was not officially allowed to. The vehicle pool was contractor infrastructure, and what happened to vehicles in the pool was not information a non-contractor was supposed to have. But more than that, he had not known how to explain it. The ship was gone. He was still here. He had used the one concrete resource he had to move something in a direction he believed was right, and he was going to have to live with that in the apartment with the dead plant and the fast clock, and without knowing what happened next. Mike had found the ship on Hookmas Woods Road. Mike was in space now. Glen was making sure the coffee was fresh. The overnight had its own population. Not the daytime population, not the people who came in for gas on their way to work, the parents buying snacks for road trips, the tourists who stopped because the GlobeStar sign was visible from the highway and they needed a bathroom. Those people moved through the store with the purposeful efficiency of people who had somewhere to be and knew where it was. The overnight population was different. They came in because the overnight was where they were. Not passing through, present. The GlobeStar at 2 a.m. was not a waypoint for them. It was a destination, which said something specific about the overnight that Glen had spent 11 months trying to articulate and hadn't quite managed yet. There was a man who came in every Tuesday and Thursday at 1:15 a.m. and bought exactly $17 worth of beef jerky. Different card every week. Different name on the card every week. Glen had never mentioned this. The man had never explained it. The transaction happened, and the jerky was purchased, and the man left, and that was Tuesday and Thursday at 1:15 a.m. There was a woman who came in at 2:30 on weekend nights and stood in front of the cold beverage cooler for an average of 4 minutes before selecting a specific brand of sparkling water that was always in the same position on the same shelf. She had never selected anything else. Glenn had once, as an experiment, moved the sparkling water to a different shelf. She had found it in 45 seconds without visible distress and bought it and left. He had put it back in the original position the next day. There was Kevin. Kevin was on the overnight staff, which meant Glenn saw him at the start and end of every shift during the overlap. Kevin had been at GlobeStar for 30 years down in Oklahoma City and had developed, over the course of those 30 years, a theory about the GlobeStar, and more specifically, this building that he had been sharing with Glenn in installments since Glenn's first week. The theory was that the GlobeStar existed in two places simultaneously.
Not like a copy.
Kevin had explained early on, with the careful precision of someone who had thought about this a great deal and wanted to be accurate.
The same store, in two places at once. I think there's a convergence point somewhere near the lottery ticket display. That's where it feels most like both.
Glenn had said. Which was accurate.
You don't believe me, Kevin said.
I believe you experience it that way, Glenn said, which was also accurate and more careful. Kevin had nodded.
I know how it sounds, but I've been here and I know this building, and something is off about the geometry. Like the distance between the cooler and the register is different depending on when you measure it.
Glenn had looked at the distance between the cooler and the register. It was, he had to admit, sometimes different, depending on when you measured it. He had filed this under things he was not going to investigate professionally, and had maintained that filing ever since. Kevin brought the theory up approximately once a week. It had evolved over Glenn's employment. The current version involved not just two simultaneous locations, but
a specific temporal relationship between them. The second location was,
Kevin believed,
running approximately 11 minutes ahead of the first, which meant that at any given moment, the GlobeStar in the second location was 11 minutes into the future relative to the GlobeStar in the first location.
So what happens in 11 minutes? Glenn had asked once, during a slow Tuesday.
That's the thing,
Kevin said.
Whatever happens here happens there 11 minutes earlier. Or whatever happens there happens here 11 minutes later. I can't tell which direction the causality runs.
Does it matter? Glenn said. Kevin had thought about this for a long time.
Probably not,
he said finally.
But I think about it.
Glenn understood thinking about things that probably didn't matter. He thought about his pickup rescheduling approximately once an hour, and it had not mattered for 11 months. The banana lady came in at 4:03 a.m. She was not, Glenn had come to understand, a banana lady in any meaningful sense. She was a woman of somewhere between 50 and 70, who moved through the store with the deliberate efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and had no interest in anything else. She selected her lottery ticket first, always from the same section of the display, always with a brief assessment that suggested she had a system, even if the system produced the same statistical outcomes as no system, and then went to the banana display and selected one banana. She had done this every night. Glenn had worked for 11 months. He had never learned her name. She put the banana and the lottery ticket on the counter. Glenn rang her up. She paid exact change. She picked up her items. Then she looked at him. Most customers did not look at Glenn. They looked at the register, or at their phone, or at the general space between themselves and the transaction. The banana lady looked at Glenn specifically, the way you look at a person when you are actually looking at them, rather than at the shape they make in your peripheral vision.
You doing okay?
She said. It was the first thing she had ever said to him. Glenn processed this for a moment.
I'm well, he said. Thank you.
She nodded, picked up her banana and her lottery ticket, left. Glenn watched the door close behind her. In 11 months of overnight shifts, he had been asked how he was doing by exactly 4 people, which was 4 more than he'd expected when he took the job, and fewer than he'd been used to before the pickup got rescheduled, and the contractor system started sending him form letters. And the difference between those 2 numbers was something he had decided not to examine directly. He made sure the coffee was fresh. His phone had buzzed at 3:12 a.m. on Tuesday. It was Mike. A photo. No caption. A corridor. Long, geometric. The walls transparent. The void visible on either side. And in the void, the stars at the angles. You only saw them from out there. Glenn recognized the corridor immediately. Corridor 14. Way Station or Veth cluster. He had processed intake paperwork for that cluster on his second posting, years before Earth. He had been at a processing station 3 systems away when he did it. He had never expected to see it from the other side. Mike was in Corridor 14, looking at Betelgeuse from the outside. He was in the ship. Glenn's ship. Glenn looked at the photo for a longer moment than he had planned to, then typed,
I wasn't allowed to tell you what the job was. I thought you might want to look again. I'm sorry it took so long.
He put the phone down on the counter and made sure the coffee was fresh and helped 2 customers and watched the door and did not pick the phone back up for 11 minutes because picking it up before Mike responded would have been a kind of pressure, and Glenn did not want to apply pressure to this specific thing. At 3:27 a.m., Mike responded, Yeah, okay. Then, thanks. Glenn read both messages, put the phone in his pocket. It was fine. That was fine. That was, in fact, exactly right. Yeah, okay. And thanks were the correct Mike responses to something that would have required a longer conversation from anyone else, and that Mike had processed in 4 minutes of silence and 2 lines of text, which was efficient and accurate and very Mike. Glenn noted in his file, Mike, first corridor, photo sent, acknowledged. Good. He did not examine how much weight was in that good. He thought about the ship sitting in a field outside Carthage, waiting, accumulating dew, and the slow patience of something that had been useful before and was going to be useful again. He thought about the vehicle release paperwork he had filed on a Tuesday at 11:23 p.m. and how the system had processed it without acknowledgement, and how he had watched the registration move from his name to the available pool on his contractor device, and felt something he still did not have a precise word for in any of the 4 languages he spoke. He had given up the one thing that could have gotten him out. Mike was out. Glenn was here. Which was fine. Which was the available option. Which he had made his peace with, because the alternative was not making peace with it, and he had decided his energy was worth more than that. He made sure the coffee was fresh. Mike called on Thursday. Glenn had been expecting it. The first week was always the adjustment period, the moment when the reality of the situation settled in and new contractors either adapted or called someone they trusted to confirm that what was happening was happening. "It's actually space," Mike said. "I know," Glenn said. There was something in Mike's voice that Glenn had heard before and had no professional term for. A kind of recalibration. The sound of a person who had believed something was one thing and discovered it was another thing, and was now doing the quiet arithmetic of what that meant. "It looks like space," Mike said, "from up here. It looks like what I thought it would look like." Glenn thought about what to say to that. He thought about Mike's profile. Astrophysics inactive. 6 years of study, whatever combination of circumstance and bad timing and the specific cruelty of fields that don't expand fast enough for everyone who loves them had produced a man sitting in his 2009 Civic outside a Wendy's at midnight, taking jobs nobody else wanted. Glenn thought about the vehicle release paperwork, about the Tuesday at 11:23 p.m., about the ship sitting in the available pool, waiting for the right job, and the right contractor to find it, and the system routing it to the right person at the right moment, because that was what the system did when you gave it the right inputs. He had given it the right inputs. That was not a comfortable thing to know, exactly. It was also not an uncomfortable thing. He had done something he couldn't undo. He found he didn't want to undo it. "How's the pay?" Glenn said, because that was the useful question. They talked for a few more minutes. Glenn answered what he could, redirected what he couldn't, and listened to Mike describe the corridor he was parked in with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to sound moved. After he hung up, Glenn stood behind the counter for a moment in the specific quiet of 11 p.m. on a Thursday, which was a dead zone between the after-work drinkers and the 2 a.m. insomniacs. His pickup had been rescheduled again. The new date was 6 weeks out. He had received this information via form letter, which had also reminded him that filing an additional complaint was an option available to him should he find the resolution unsatisfactory. He found it unsatisfactory. He did not file a complaint. Outside, a car pulled in, the banana lady, 2 hours earlier than usual. She came through the door, went directly to the lottery tickets, selected one with the focused deliberation of a person who has developed a system, then went to the banana display and selected one banana. She put both on the counter. Glenn rang her up. She looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him, a little longer than necessary, with the quality of someone who was about to say something and was deciding whether to say it. She paid, took her banana and her lottery ticket, left. Glenn watched the taillights disappear. He made sure the coffee was fresh. Darnell would be coming through in a few hours. The overnight had a rhythm. Glenn had learned the rhythm. The difference between understanding it and being part of it had stopped mattering a long time ago. His phone showed one new notification from the contractor system. He opened it. Pickup rescheduled.
New estimated date to be determined. Thank you for your patience. Your placement is important to us.
Glenn put his phone in his pocket. The coffee finished brewing. The store was quiet. Somewhere out there, Mike Briggs was in Glenn's ship, driving through a corridor, between way stations, looking at stars he used to know the names of. And Glenn was here, which was fine, which was the available option, which he had made his peace with. The fluorescent light above, Register 2, flickered. It had been flickering for 3 weeks. Glenn had put in a maintenance request. He had not heard back. Kevin came in for the overlap at 6 a.m. with yesterday's jacket and his coffee ratio, and said, while pouring,
I timed it last night. The distance between the cooler and the register. It was different at 2 a.m. than at 4 a.m.
"How different?" Glenn said.
About 1.5 feet,
Kevin said.
I measured with the mop handle.
Glenn looked at the distance between the cooler and the register. He said.
I know,
Kevin said.
I know how it sounds.
He was not wrong about how it sounded. He was also not wrong about the measurement. Glenn did not say either of these things out loud. He took off his vest, hung it up, went home. The Missouri morning was doing what Missouri mornings do, which is arrive regardless of whether you're ready for it. Gray and specific, and smelling like cut grass, and someone else's coffee, and the particular quality of air that has been up all night the same as you. Glenn drove home, made tea, went to bed, thought about the distance between the cooler and the register, which was sometimes different depending on when you measured it, and about Mike somewhere in Glenn's ship, in a corridor looking at stars he used to know the names of, and about the form letter that said his placement was important to them. Decided not to think about any of it too directly. Went to sleep. The next night, Glenn came back to the store. This was not unusual. Glenn came back to the store every night. But this night, he came back paying attention to something he had not been paying attention to before. He had been thinking, on the drive in, about the word no. Glenn began researching no. Not formally, just paying attention in a different way to the media that moved through the store. The television above the register that nobody had ever changed the channel on. The conversations customers had on their phones. The comedy specials that played at 3 a.m. when the store was quiet enough to hear them. He was looking for examples of no in the wild. He found them everywhere once he started looking. People saying no to bad situations, no to things that weren't right, no to the shape of things they'd been handed and hadn't chosen. He noted the context. He noted the deliveries. He noted the way the word landed differently, depending on how it was carried. Soft no, hard no, quiet no, T. He no that came out sideways as a joke, the no that came out of nowhere and meant everything. He filed all of this. The problem, he was beginning to understand, was not knowing the word. The problem was that no had texture. No had register. No had 100 different ways of arriving, and each one meant something slightly different, and the difference mattered in ways his contractor training had never prepared him for, because his contractor training had been built on a substrate of yes, and yes was clean and simple, and yes always meant yes. No was complicated. No required judgment. Glenn was not sure his judgment was calibrated correctly for this. He kept researching. He had also begun to notice something about human interaction that he had previously categorized as anomalous. but was now beginning to understand as standard. Humans were, with some regularity, rude to each other. Not maliciously, just casually. A kind of friction in the social fabric that everyone seemed to accept as normal and occasionally even to appreciate. The customers who came in at 3 a.m. were often rude in small ways, not to GLEN specifically, just generally, to the world, to the situation of being awake at 3 a.m., needing things from a convenience store. And other customers seemed to find this not offensive, but somehow correct. Real, human. GLEN filed this. He was trying to learn the full range of what acceptable looked like in this culture. No, he was increasingly certain, was somewhere in that range. He just needed to find the right delivery. It was a Wednesday at 2:47 a.m. when he found The Comedian. Comedy special on the screen above the register. GLEN had seen parts of it before, on other nights. But this was the first time he caught the bit about the job. The terrible boss, the unreasonable request. The situation that was clearly wrong in a way everyone could see, except the people responsible for it. The comedian built to it, with the specific confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going, and then said the thing with a timing GLEN recognized immediately as the correct delivery of a no. Assertive, clean, weighted exactly right. No shit. The audience laughed. GLEN watched this very carefully. The no was there, clear and unambiguous. And the shit was the emphasis, the human texture behind it, the thing that made the no land with the cultural weight it needed. It was rude in the way GLEN had been observing humans be rude, casually, acceptably, in a way that the audience received not as offensive, but as honest, as real. And the audience approved. The audience laughed. The laughter was the indicator GLEN had learned to read as something being correct and also socially acceptable, and also demonstrating a kind of competence that humans respected in each other. GLEN wrote it down. No shit. Strong. Clear. Audience approves. Correct register for assertive no. Incorporates acceptable human rudeness. Culturally textured. He practiced it quietly, behind the counter when no customers were present. No shit, he said to the coffee machine. The coffee machine did not respond. He was ready. The customer came in at 4:15, tired, awake longer than they wanted to be. A convenience store at 4:15 a.m. as a necessary interruption to the project of getting home. Looked at the restroom door. Looked at GLEN. Asked the question with the mild resignation of someone who had encountered restroom codes before and found them a small but genuine imposition on a person who simply needed to use a restroom. Is there a code for the restroom? GLEN thought about the comedian. He thought about Mike, standing at the door with his jacket on, saying no is a real word. About weeks of research. About the texture and register of no, and the acceptable human rudeness, and the audience laughing. He also thought about the restroom. He had cleaned the restroom at 6 a.m. yesterday, and again at 10 p.m. tonight. He had been in there with the mop and the cleaning solution that corporate specified, and the specific thoroughness that GLEN brought to cleaning things. He had direct empirical knowledge of the current conditions of that restroom. He was, in this moment, the foremost authority on the present state of that restroom in the greater Carthage metropolitan area. The customer was asking about the restroom. GLEN had information about the restroom. GLEN had also found his no. He delivered it with full commitment, with the timing of the comedian, with the assertive clarity and the acceptable human texture, and the cultural weight he had been studying for weeks. He delivered it the way the comedian had delivered it, with full commitment, with the weight it needed. No shit. The customer stared at him. GLEN held the no. This was the part he had prepared for. The resistance, the discomfort, the moment where the no had landed, and the other person was processing it. GLEN had read about this. The no created a gap, and the gap had to resolve. And while the gap was resolving, the person who had said the no needed to hold their position. This was what made a no, instead of a maybe. GLEN held his position. The customer continued staring. Something in the dynamic was slightly off, but GLEN could not immediately locate what. The delivery had been correct. The timing had been correct. The emphasis had been correct. The comedian's audience had responded positively to this exact formulation. GLEN had practiced it. The customer said slowly,
So there is a code.
GLEN ran the interaction back. The customer had asked if there was a code for the restroom. GLEN had answered with information about the restroom. The restroom contained no shit. GLEN had cleaned it. This was accurate. The customer had interpreted this as information about the code. The customer had also not received the code. The customer still needed the code. GLEN identified the variable he had missed. Yes, GLEN said. The code is 4732. The customer went to the restroom without further comment. GLEN stood behind the counter. He thought about this for the rest of the shift, with the focused attention of someone doing a detailed post-mortem on an incident that had not gone the way it was supposed to go. GLEN wrote in his notes,
No shit. Deployment context requires further study. Factual accuracy about restroom conditions is not the same as assertive no, even when both are true simultaneously. Register unclear. Human no operates on multiple simultaneous layers that do not always align with literal meaning. The comedian knew something about this that I do not yet know. More research needed.
He thought about Mike saying no is a real word. You can use it. It works. GLEN believed this. It was fine. It was going to be fine. He made sure the coffee was fresh. It was almost 3:40. Darnell would be through in 7 minutes. GLEN would say yes to Darnell's large coffee and specific jerky and exact change, and much obliged, and Darnell would leave, and GLEN would stand behind the counter in the quiet of a Carthage night and think about no until the morning. He had a lot more research to do.
I don't think you faithful audience have to do more research on the word no, but there I go and put words in your mouth. Thanks for listening. Get ready for the next episode on the archive on Sundays.